a war on Islam, a direct war on every single Muslim in this country.
This is Professor David Miller, sociologist and expert in Islamophobia, propaganda, spin and lobbying. He spent years academically studying Zionism and its connection to global Islamophobia, and he states that not many people know this, but the recent far-right riots in the UK were instigated by the so-called State of Israel.
The Muslim community is like a sleeping giant. We just need to be convinced of...
Wake him up.
He also discussed something very interesting about the unrecognised strength of the Muslim community and the duties that comes with.
They lie and they lie and they lie. Zionism is intrinsically racist, intrinsically genocidal. We're only standing up to racism in this country.
Stay tuned to learn more in this episode of Empowered by Islam 21C, where we collaborate with leading voices to discuss our solutions to 21st century challenges and trends.
So you came out and said at the beginning of these riots, these latest race riots in the UK, that they're actually behind, the people behind them are Zionists. You came out and said that Zionists are behind these UK riots. Isn't that an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory?
Well, you're making a mistake, which Zionists make. And of course, in their cases, they don't make it as a mistake. They do it deliberately, of confusing the Jews with the Zionists. These are separate things, as everybody knows.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it was incorrect to say the Zionists are behind the riots, it wouldn't be anti-Semitic because it's an argument about the factual matters that are going on here.
Mm.
Now, if you want me to tell you who is behind the riots and what I think about that, I feel free to ask.
Yeah. So who is behind the riots?
Well, look, the people who were most obviously involved in sparking the riots, the person who was most obviously, was a guy called Tommy Robinson. Otherwise known, of course, as Stephen Christopher Yaxley Lennon. And of course, he changed his name to Tommy Robinson to make it sound more English, because Lennon is, of course, an Irish name. And he sparked it after the Southport events when 3 young girls were stabbed to death. And it was said immediately that this was by a Muslim. And he, of course, amplified that to many, many followers. And that's what led to the riots starting. Of course, we know that it wasn't a Muslim. It wasn't an immigrant. It was a person who was British, who was born here, was Christian, came of Rwandan heritage. But nevertheless, it was Tommy Robinson. Now, who is Tommy Robinson? Tommy Robinson, of course, is someone who burst onto the public scene in 2009. But to understand where Tommy Robinson comes from, where the EDL came from, and where we now are with that process, we need to go back a little bit further than 2009 to 2007, when a conference was held in the European Parliament called the Counter-Jihad Europa Conference. And this was a conference which was called by an organization called the Centre for Vigilant Freedom, which now doesn't exist anymore. And the press release, which was issued to announce that conference, the Counter-Jihad Conference, a conference of Islamophobes from all across Europe, the press release was sent from an address in a place called Wakefield, which you might have heard of. It's in the UK. And it was sent by a guy who lived in Leeds and who was a director of the Centre for Vigilant Freedom. What is the Centre for Vigilant Freedom? It's an organization which was set up by a woman and led by a woman called Christine Brim, a US citizen, who also at the same time was the chief operating officer of the Centre for Security Policy, one of the key nodes in the US Islamophobia network. Now, as everybody knows who's looked at this a little bit, the Islamophobia network in the US was largely funded by the Zionists. It's not a matter for dispute. It's there in the record. The Centre for American Progress did the most famous report on this back in the day, and everybody knows that the Zionists fund Islamophobia in the US, and everyone who pays attention also should know that the Zionists fund Islamophobia in this country. They know, I guess, certainly from the research that we've done, that the key Islamophobia from above think tanks, that's the Henry Jackson Society, the Policy Exchange, which is where Douglas Murray comes from, etc. These were funded by largely by Zionist family foundations in this country, and sometimes from the US too. So we know that the Counter-Jihad Europa conference was set up by the Centre for Vigilant Freedom, part of the Centre for Security Policy. What then happens? Well, the people involved in that, including the guy who sent the press release out from Wakefield, then were involved in meetings in London. This guy was called Chris Knowles, by the way. Were involved in meetings in London, which set up the English Defence League, at which Tommy Robinson was appointed the leader. Which the financier Alan Ayling, who is a Christian but fanatical Zionist, was present, and also present was a woman called who went by the pseudonym, as many of them have pseudonyms, of Gaia, was also present. She was a woman who's a financier, made money in property, lived at that stage in a £1.8 million house in London, and of course was also a director of the Centre for Vigilant Freedom. So the EDL was set up, let me say this, crudely and correctly, by the Zionists. Right now, what happened after that? There's a whole story we can tell about that, which we probably haven't got time to go into. But if you want to ask me about that, you can. The EDL, of course, was collapsed in 2014, and Tommy Robinson goes on to become a kind of a journalist, he calls himself, but a sort of a far-right internet celebrity, I suppose. And he's put in jail various times, and there's all sorts of stories about him, which you can go and read online. But we also know that after the collapse of the EDL, that he received funding from a whole range of US and Canadian sources. Now, the network I've just explained to you about, the Centre for Vigilant Freedom, the Centre for Security Policy, that also becomes, the Centre for Vigilant Freedom becomes the International Civil Liberties Alliance, and it also has common personnel. The woman Christine Brim, who is at the CSP and at the CVF, also at the ICLA, is also in an organisation called the International Free Press Society, which is based in the States, but had come originally from Denmark as part of the Counter Jihad network. That's one part of the Zionist network, which has run the EDL and Tommy Robinson over this period. Another part of the network, which also is Zionist, has been a range of other organizations, such as, for example, and again, this has been reported in The Guardian, it's not a secret, for example, the Philadelphia-based Middle East Forum, run by the famous Islamophobe Daniel Pipes. Again, Middle East Forum, another nexus in the Islamophobia network in the US. And also, there's been support from other similar organizations, from people like the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Front Page magazine, which is run by the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and then latterly for Robinson from an organization in Canada, which is called Rebel News, or Rebel Media, sometimes it's called. And people say, so I saw, for example, David Rosenberg from the Jewish Socialist Group at a demo in Finchley over the weekend saying, well, Tommy Robinson gets money from wherever he can, and he gets money from American sources and Canadian sources and some pro-Israeli sources. So it's not, so he's saying it's not the Zionists who are doing this. But of course, all of the sources to which he is referring are Zionist organizations, or Zionist-funded organizations run by fanatical pro-Israel activists. The Middle East Forum and the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and Rebel News are variously run by Zionists. Rebel News in Canada is run by a guy called Ezra Levant, with one of these, he's an Ashkenazi Jewish guy who, of course, has a name which suggests that he comes from the Levant, which, of course, he doesn't, since the Ashkenazi Jews don't come from that place. So then we have three organizations, all fanatically Zionist, all have been funding Tommy Robinson. Where do they get their funding from? Well, from a variety of sources, including some of these organizations have had funding from AIPAC, the Israel Lobby Group, but largely from a whole range of conservative foundations, most of which are Zionist. So from the Abstraction Fund, or from the Donors Capital Fund, which is an anonymous pass-through, etc., etc. But the one person, and I've only just discovered this really, the one person that connects all three of those organizations that I've just mentioned is a guy called Robert Shillman. Now, he paid for Tommy Robinson to write and do video pieces for Rebel News from 2017. And he's also funded the MEF and Horowitz, etc. So Shillman is a key figure in this. And we could conjecture, we don't know this, we could conjecture that he's played quite a role in directing some of this. Now, so one of the things that people say is, oh yes, but that was in 2018. I mean, the data's out of date. you know, I mean, how can you say he's an asset? He's had money from other places, etc., etc. And if you look at the various reports that have come out, you do see money from other places. I see that there's a report from Nafiz Ahmed, I think on Byline recently, which
Hmm.
goes through a series of different funding sources that he's had. Doesn't mention the word Israel, doesn't mention the Z word, the controversial Z word, but of course some of the funds that he's talking about are Zionist funds. And I mean, I saw one the other, he tweeted the other day, just recently, about how there was some connection to Breitbart, as if this showed that it was
Hmm.
that Tommy Robinson was some kind of Trumpian conspiracy. But Breitbart, of course, fundamentally was a Zionist operation run by Zionists, set up by Zionists, and funded by Zionists, as anyone who's looked
Yeah.
into these things would know. But of course, people don't look into these things, and they don't even come to this with be able to ask the right questions. They don't even conceive that they could ask the question, well, to what extent are the Zionists involved in this, and how organized are they, how connected are they, etc. Right now, when you ask questions, there are connections. Let me finish this point by saying, so is the data out of date? Well, the data from Middle East Forum, yes, that was 2018. And the data from Rebel News was 2018 as well, 2016, 17, and 18, I think. But if you have a cursory look around the internet, which I'm prone to do, you see that Tommy Robinson was in Canada in June. Did you notice that? And he was arrested. What was he doing in Canada? Well, he'd been booked, note the word booked, to do several talks in Canada by
Mm.
Rebel News. And when he was arrested, so booked implies, of course, airfares and fees. And when he was arrested, Rebel News posted an appeal for money to be sent to cover his legal costs. That's that's 2 months ago. So if that's not too out of date, we can show the
Very
money.
much in date.
I mean, this is ridiculous. This is the whole of this project. And I don't just mean the EDL and Tommy Robinson. I mean the whole of the Count As You Had project across the whole of Europe is something
Mhm.
which was started by and directed by pro-Israel forces. So you see, for
Mm.
example, the most popular politician in the Netherlands now, Geert Wilders, of course, was part of that network and has been funded by the same people, by Shilman, for example, and many others. So this is demonstrably the case. Now, people say to you, well, of course, the tensions have been mounting in this country for some time. There's been austerity. The far right have encouraged this and that. Well, and I say, yes, well, some of those things are true. And of course, other themes were brought into these demonstrations. Migration, attacking migration centres, and all that stuff was brought into it. Other themes by the elements of the far right involved in these. But the point of the Count As You Had network was, of course, to wean the far right away from being A, anti-Zionist, and B, Judeophobic, and towards being simply Islamophobic. And that was very successful. Most of the far right in Europe is now
Mm.
just Islamophobic. It's Judeophilic, it's pro-Israel, it's Zionist. And of course, we saw, you can see this anytime you want to search Google images, you can see the images of Tommy Robinson with his IDF t-shirt on top of the Merkava tank with his weapon at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem,
Mm.
Al-Aqsa Mosque, and all that stuff. That's all visible to anyone who has the eyes to look and to conceive of what's going on there. And what's going on there, of course, is this is an operation run effectively by the State of Israel and the Zionist movement.
Mm. Wow, you just gave like a masterclass with all the key piece of information. We need to definitely unpack that. But on this kind of proximal cause for these riots and this eruption in violence in particular, um, I don't know where your research has led you, but where was the original disinformation about this trigger from? That this person who murdered 3 little girls, that he was a Muslim, he was a undocumented migrant. Did you get anywhere with that? Would that link to Tommy Robinson and therefore Zionists?
No, not so far. I mean, it's said that the person who first said it was a Muslim, deleted it within the hour, and that she, I think, was a lockdown skeptic, etc. So that may or may not be the first person who said it. But no, there's no. The link comes in when it was amplified by Robinson, and that's what sparked the
Yeah.
riot.
Okay. So it is, again, I guess, um, warranted to say that these riots were sparked by Zionist so-called asset Tommy Robinson,
That's right.
even
I
though
mean,
he denies it now.
yes, of course. I mean, I think I would put it
Mm,
as straightforwardly as that Israel pushed the riot button. Well, why did Israel push the riot button?
yeah.
Well, two reasons. One is that the British government dropped its objection to the war crimes arrests for Gallant and Netanyahu, and the other is the apparent pause in arms sales to Israel. Now, whether that's a genuine pause or not, I don't know, but the information that it was a pause was out there. So
Mhm.
that's the likely relationship.
Yeah. I mean, to someone watching who hasn't maybe been paying as much attention as you have, it will seem to them very strange that Israel, which purports to be a pro-Jewish country, a Jewish state, is fomenting far-right, xenophobic kind of narratives and personalities and influences throughout Europe. Someone would even say fascist. Isn't that kind of hard to believe, like literally unbelievable? Where what is it? What is um, in it for them? What is in it for the state of Israel? Aren't they playing with? Wouldn't they be kind of doing a gigantic own goal by fomenting people that um, you know are historically seen as the most anti-Jewish people on earth?
But they're not anymore. I mean, that's the point. They've been co-opted by the state of
Mm,
Israel, such that they are Judeophilic. They love the Jews. They love Zionism. They are
mhm,
there as a weapon to target Islam and to make it very difficult for Muslims to function in this society and other Western societies, to try and make it difficult for Muslims to practice their religion, and to try and beat and intimidate Muslim populations such that they will not be engaged in supporting the Palestinians. Now, I mean, Robinson said this from
mm,
his five-star hotel in Cyprus. He posted a video on X, formerly Twitter, where he said, "Look, people are asking me why are people angry. And I'll tell you why people are angry." He said it's because Hamas have overtook London, which I think he meant taken over London, and they've been allowed to fly their jihad flags and their ISIS flags and
mm,
and their Hamas flags, and that's why we're angry. I mean, it couldn't really be much clearer than that. I don't think. I mean, this is what he says, right? He also says, he said
yeah.
in a different interview on Israeli television, that when Israel falls, or if Israel falls, then they will come for us too. And who's they? Of course, it's the Muslims, and of course, it plays into
Mm.
the
Ancient
anti-Islam,
myths.
well, not ancient myths, specific theories like the Great Replacement, and
Mm,
of course, the theory of Eurabia. Now, what is the theory of Eurabia? The theory of Eurabia is that the Arabs will take over Europe, and that will be done by massive Muslim immigration. White people will become a minority. There will be white genocide, etc., all this kind of nonsense, right? Now, where does that theory come from? It's a far right theory, yeah. Where does it come from? It was popularized by a woman called Bat Yor, which, of course, is another pseudonym. Her real name, as you perhaps know, is Giselle Littman. And who is
mm,
Giselle Littman? She's a Zionist operative. She, in an earlier part of her life, along with her husband David Littman, was involved as Mossad operatives in Morocco in kidnapping Jewish children to take them to become colonists in Palestine. This is a woman who used to work for the Mossad. And we're supposed to believe that there's a kind of antithesis between the far right and Zionism. There is no such antithesis.
mm,
There never has been any such antithesis before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust. I mean, let me give you another example. Maybe people are not familiar with this. Who was it who co-founded the Nazi Azov battalion in Ukraine? It was a guy called Nathan Kazan. Which military did he used to belong to? The IDF. He's an IDF.
mm.
former paratrooper. So the idea that there's a distinction that the Jews wouldn't get involved with the fascists is ridiculous. I mean, it's not borne out by the actuality. We knew from the beginning of this. I mean, I look back at, I run a website called Spinwatch, have done since 2005, and I look back at some of the early work we've done as part of looking at this. And I rediscovered that we'd published stuff in 2011 setting out all of this stuff about the origins of the EDL. We've known it for a long, long time. We've known that the Zionists have been involved in this for a long, long time. But people tend to selectively forget, or never to have come across the data, or not to have read fantastic work that we did back in 2011. So I mean, there is no antithesis between the far right and Israel, and Israel will use whatever weapon is at its disposal. And is there anybody in the world left who thinks that the Israelis would not do anything at all to pursue their interests? I mean, we see on a daily basis the most appalling crimes that nobody has seen in the last half century, 70 years, 80 years. Nobody has seen these things. And they each, almost every day, they better themselves. They have, the Nazis didn't have rape camps in the way that the Zionists do. They have this death and rape camp in the Nakab, or they call it the Negev Desert. And just to be clear, this is a camp which is not very far from an IDF base where there is a nice swimming pool, which was gifted to the IDF on that base by a British organisation called the UK Friends of the Association for the Wellbeing of Israel's Soldiers. And it was opened in 2021 with a display by the Israeli National Synchronized Swimming Team. So while the Gazans, everyone's seen the videos, have no water, have no food, are subject to epidemics, random bombing, they're told to go to safe places, and the safe places are deliberately bombed and attacked by the Zionists, who then make up nonsense about targeting Hamas, by which, of course, they mean the various 8 or 9 different factions of the Palestinian resistance. They make up rubbish. I mean, we've seen this just in the last day. They've put out a list of 20 Hamas operatives that they killed in the course of killing 80 or 90 largely children in a school, which was a safe area. And of course, some of these people who they've listed, not only are they not members of the Qassam Brigades or the Al-Quds Brigades or the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, they're civilians, but not only are they civilians, but they were killed on different days before the actual bombing that they're trying to excuse. I mean, they lie and they lie and they lie, and we've known that from the almost the very beginning of this process, with the stories about 40 beheaded babies and mass rapes and the killing of 1,200 people and all of that, and all of which have been fundamentally, repeatedly debunked. But it doesn't make any difference to them. They continue to retell lies as if anyone with any sense will believe them.
I mean, you mentioned something that I've never heard before in terms of not just saying, okay, Zionists and fascists, they might be working together for something, a common cause, that's politically expedient for both. But you're actually saying that they're actually fundamentally, why would there be a distinction between their interests? They're fundamentally, the default position is almost axiomatically that they are, bedfellows almost. Is this because you read an element of white supremacy into Zionism and the state of Israel itself? Is it the European origins of the settler colonists? Is there, as a sociologist, do you kind of look at it that way?
Well, the first thing to say is that the primary contradiction in Palestine is the contradiction of settler colonialism. It's not the question of imperialism abstractly. It's not the question of class abstractly. It's the question of settler colonialism. I mean, if you look at all settler colonial societies, they must do the same sorts of things, not necessarily as bad as in the case of Israel. They must do the same sort of things. They must try and eliminate or remove the natives. And that's what they did in
Mhm.
Algeria, that's what they did in South Africa, and that's of course what they did in Ireland. I mean, famously in 1921, they drew the border of Northern Ireland so they could exclude 3 Catholic counties, so there would always be a Protestant majority. That's what settler colonialism is and what it does. It has to remove the natives or kill them, right? And in successful settler colonial societies, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America, they're successful. They kill all the natives, such that there are too few to make any difference, even in the relatively civilized cases of genocide in, for example, New Zealand. And that's what settler colonialism is and what it does. So it has to be racist, it has to be genocidal, and it has to be maximalist. It wants to pursue those agendas. Now, in the specific case of Zionism, Zionism wants to be maximalist in a different sense. It wants to be maximalist in the sense not just of having all of the territory of historic Palestine, but of having what is it they call it, Eretz Yisrael, which of course is the Greater Israel, which, depending on which map by which particular section of rabid genocidal Zionists you look at, includes all of Jordan, some of Egypt, most of Syria, all of Lebanon, part of Turkey, most of Iraq, right up to the borders with Iran. So that's what they intend, and possibly more. So it's a settler colonial situation, and they will happily work with others who have similar sorts of ideas about nation. And so that, I mean, the case of Ukraine is instructive. I mean, you can talk about the Nazis, right? Tony Greenstein has written, I think, probably the definitive book on this, on the collaboration between the Zionists and the Nazis. And you can make the argument, the Zionists make the argument that, well, it was only desperation, etc. And there's some force in some of that. We should go on to talk about it, but let's bracket that away from this question. Now, look at the question of Ukraine. Now, the Zionists movement, one of the earliest progenitors of the Zionist movement, was created in what is today Ukraine. It was called the Lovers of Zion. The Zionists were very strong in Ukraine, in particular in Odessa. Odessa was formed after the rout of the Ottoman Empire in the 1790s, when they removed all the Muslims, just about, with the Ottomans, and the Russians took over, and Catherine the Great decreed that this empty land should be settled by Russian settlers, or people who would be loyal to Russia, and that included Jewish people. So that's partly why there was such a lot of Jews went to Odessa. They weren't the only settler colonists there. There were Germans and others, and so Odessa became a very Jewish city. And amongst the early Zionists who grew up in Odessa, or who lived in Odessa for some period, was a guy called Vladimir Jabotinsky, the leader of the revisionist Zionist movement. That's the tradition which finds expression today in the Likud party, and the tradition of Benjamin Netanyahu. And was involved.
What kind of year roughly are we talking about here?
Oh, this is the 1920s.
Okay.
In the 1920s. And so he was involved with a guy who was a Ukrainian nationalist called Simon Petliura, who had been involved in pogroms against the Jews. Let's leave it at pogroms. I don't want to say if it was genocide or not. I'm not sure. Pogroms against the Jews, very significant killings of Jews. And Jabotinsky made a deal with Petliura, and he even quipped at one point that this is what they would put on his gravestone: "Here lies Vladimir Jabotinsky, the man who made a deal with the fascist Simon Petliura." And Petliura, of course, was assassinated in Paris by a Jewish Russian anarchist on the basis of retribution for the pogroms. So that involvement with the far right in Ukraine is in the very genesis of the Zionist movement, because they had similar ideas about their superiority. Like you said, white supremacy. Well, I would. People say white supremacy, and they say, well, it's because the Jews are the Ashkenazi Jews who went to steal Palestine were European and weren't Arab. And you could have the argument about that. I would say that what's clear about Zionism is that it's a Jewish supremacist ideology. It's not a white supremacist ideology; it's a Jewish supremacist ideology, and it's important to see, I think, to see that, because it means that it makes it easier to understand that actually Zionism might not really be always wanting to be an ally of Western imperialism. And in fact, if you look at the sayings of the ultras in the government, the Ben Gavirs and the Smotrics, of course, this is their hubris to some extent. They're saying, well, we don't care about the Americans. We're going to do this anyhow. We're going to take over the whole land. We'll have a second Nakba. We will get rid of them. We will kill Hamas, blah, blah, blah. And so I think it's important to understand this is a Jewish supremacist ideology. And it plays a role in relation to white supremacy, yes, but I think it's more accurate to talk about it in those terms.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, going back to, you mentioned the likes of Douglas Murray and neocons in terms of kind of Islamophobia trickling down from above. And I think you mentioned it in your famous piece of research, the 5 pillars of Islamophobia. And the Zionist organizations and neocon organizations are part of those.
Yeah.
The pillars of Islamophobia in the UK. I think you said generally in the world.
Yeah.
What did you make of Douglas Murray finding himself on the front line, basically, when the recent wave of the genocide took off? Post October 7th.
So do you mean Douglas Murray going to occupy Palestine in the aftermath of
October 7th? I mean, I saw him all over the all over the news, kind of wheeling him out for giving comments and getting interviews from people on the ground. Piers Morgan had him on almost every other day, it felt like.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, Murray is an ultra-Zionist. He's an Islamophobe. I'm not terribly surprised at him doing that. That's what he does. I mean, he's there to pursue the interests of the Zionist colony under the guise, I suppose. I mean, he tries to disguise what he does, doesn't he, under some kind of lofty principles or something. But he's an Islamophobe. He's a Zionist, and that's where the money comes from, and that's the things he believes in.
When it comes to these riots in particular, in the last few weeks, we've seen lots of people who, many would say, fomented them and provoked them, kind of turned their back on the people that actually carried out the violence and kind of almost like throwing them under the bus, proverbially. Calling them, right-wing thugs, far-right thugs, hooligans, and so forth. Would you say it's a far right in terms of, from the bigger picture, is it really the far right that's to blame for this, or do you see the causes elsewhere? So you mentioned Zionism already, Zionist agitators, but what other kind of significant blame, where else does it lie, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that how I would see these riots is that this is an attempt by Israel to exert pressure from the bottom up, as opposed to the way that they normally pursue Islamophobia, or one of the other ways they pursue Islamophobia, which is from the top down, so from the think tanks and Parliament, all that sort of thing, and through the counter-terrorism apparatus, etc. So, I mean, I think that's the wider context. I've heard people talk about this, and they talk about austerity and the migration crisis and how it's been handled, and they talk about
too many brown folks.
Well, I mean, from the left talking about this, I'm talking about this is the context, but I don't think that. I mean, that provides the actual context, but I don't think it is the context. And I think let's be clear here. The context of this is the genocide in Gaza. That's the context, and we absolutely must resist the idea that we should first of all stop talking about Gaza and go on to talk about benefits or immigration hotels or any of that stuff, which is not relevant. They're doing this because of Gaza, because they have lost the argument globally and internationally. Most young people in this country, according to the polls, now believe that Israel shouldn't exist. Now, that's never happened before, and that's a fantastic victory for our movement. And we should not think that what we've got to do now is because the far right is on the prowl, that we have to have unity such that we focus only on the far right. And there are very, very worrying signs. There are large sections of the left who believe that. Stand Up to Racism, for example, that the famous clip, you've probably seen it, from Oxford, where that young Muslim woman starts talking about Palestine, and they say, this is not a Palestine demo. You can't talk about Palestine here, and they cut her microphone off. Now, that's happened all around the country. Same kind of argument. Stand Up to Racism say, we're only standing up to racism in this country. And if let's take that at face value for a minute. Well, first of all, why? And second of all, do they imagine that Zionists are not racist in this country with particular impacts in this country? And of course, when you ask the question, that's to answer it. Of course, the Zionists are active. Of course, the Zionists push Islamophobic policies. Of course, the Zionists are behind the formation of the prevent policy, of the counter-extremism policy. I mean, just this year, we had Michael Gove stand up in Parliament and introduce his apparent new definition of extremism, which of course it isn't a definition because they can't define it. But anyhow, they introduced this new policy. Where did the policy come from? It came from an independent report written by Lord Shawcross, the former head of the Charity Commission. And Michael Gove adopted pretty much everything that was in that report. Where did Lord Shawcross get his report from? Well, he more or less adopted all the recommendations in a report from the Policy Exchange. And so the Policy Exchange produced a report which went into the Independent Examiner's report, which went into government policy. So the Policy Exchange is writing government policy on extremism. Where was Lord Shawcross appointed to his independent role from? Policy fellow at the Policy Exchange. Who was one of the two co-founders, the founding chairs of the Policy Exchange? Michael Gove. Where does the Policy Exchange get its funding from? It gets it from the Zionists, and in particular from the Wolfson family, who own Next, as well as a number of other Zionist family foundations. So this is a process of encouraging a war on Islam, a direct war on every single Muslim in this country, by the Zionists, and we're supposed to believe that there's no racism from Zionism in this country. It's a fantasy. So that's the first point. And the second point, of course, is that the Zionists are behind the riots, and the idea that we have people who are in favour, essentially, of genocide in Gaza and indeed of Islamophobia in this country on our demonstrations, or that we must avoid offending Zionists, because let's remember, these are the nice Zionists. These are the liberal and left-wing and socialist Zionists who don't believe any of that stuff and come out with very nice things about Islamophobia, but who nevertheless are Zionists and fundamentally are racists. I mean, that's the end of it. And if they want us not to offend them, then they can feel free all they want to say that they don't want to be offended. They don't want to be told that Zionism is racism. But we're not going to stop, because Zionism is racism, and there is an ineluctable relationship, a fundamental relationship between Zionism and racism. So that's what I would say about this. There's a problem on the left, is that people are saying we should stop talking about Palestine because we will offend some people who could be on our side, but they're not really on our side.
I mean, I was going to ask you the question, what's your kind of message with regards to British leftists? But you kind of already preempted that in terms of.
I could say lots more. I mean, I think that it's not just, this is not just a problem with Stand Up to Racism. This is a problem with the whole of the British left. So I'm talking about the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I'm talking about the Stop the War Coalition. I'm talking about the Socialist Workers' Party. I'm talking about Counterfire, and of course all the other sundry revolutionary left organisations, Socialist Party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, etc., all of whom have inadequate positions on Palestine. They're the kind of the Revolutionary Communist Party, for example, has a two-nation theory on Palestine. That there are two nations there, and we have to think about how we meet the needs of the Jewish nation in Palestine. No. This is a settler colonial situation, and what do you do to solve settler colonial situation? One, you kill all the natives, which of course is not what we want. Or two, you decolonize, and that's what has to happen. It has to be decolonization, and the left is weak on all of these questions. And so you find that, for example, I've been deplatformed by the SWP, by Stop the War, by Palestine Solidarity, by Counterfire, by many others on totally spurious grounds, but by the JVL, by Brick Up, a whole range of organisations, and that's because they have weak positions on Zionism. And even that when the SWP, in its tradition, the international socialist tradition, was anti-Zionist from the beginning. I mean, its theoretical lodestar, a guy called Tony Cliff, changed his name to Tony Cliff from Igael Gluckstein when he came from what was then Mandate Palestine to the UK. And he wrote some stuff, for example, even before the creation of the State of Israel, which is coruscating on socialist Zionism, because he had the experience of the early colonists there. He was an anti-Zionist, and I believe that the SWP still is formally anti-Zionist, but they don't have any principled anti-Zionist position, and they don't have any.
So who is there that's left? Who is left? I don't mean left as in left and right, but who remains in terms of
there's very few.
ally for actual.
What we need is an anti-Zionist movement. Okay, we don't have an anti-Zionist movement. We have the possibility of an anti-Zionist movement, and we have a lot of sympathy. More than half of young people believe that the State of Israel should end, which is an anti-Zionist position. And so we need to make that into a proper movement, and that will mean either taking over or blowing away the existing organisations which have become sclerotic and have poor analysis of what's going on in the society. There are organisations which are anti-Zionist. I'm in Bristol. There's an organisation here called the Bristol Palestine Alliance, which is anti-Zionist. The Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, led by Mick Napier in Scotland, is an anti-Zionist organisation. It's fantastic, and they do fantastic work. There is also, of course, let's think of this in a wider context. The cutting edge of the anti-Zionist movement in this country is Palestine Action. They are the ones who say, we will not just be doing marches. Marches are important for some things, but we'll not just be doing marches. We will go into arms factories and we will smash them up. We will stop them from working. They are involved directly in killing children, and they have to be stopped. And that is what the anti-Zionist movement ought to be doing. It ought to be doing that in relation to arms factories, but also in relation to the thousands of Zionist charities that are in this country who, on a daily basis, are involved in supporting the genocide, including, for example, the one I mentioned, setting up the swimming pool for the IDF in the Nakab Desert. But many, many other such charities which are engaged in settlement and ethnic cleansing and all sorts of other appalling activities. These are organizations which should be shut down. And that's why I call for the dismantling of Zionism, not just in Palestine, but here in France, in Germany, in Argentina, in Brazil, in America, wherever it raises its ugly head.
So let me ask a question that might be on some people's minds, maybe by way of kind of devil's advocate. Someone might say, okay, what you're describing is Zionism as it's manifest today in genocide in the state of Israel. But Zionism, can't there be like a nice peaceful Zionist who just believes that, Jews should have a homeland somewhere, and that wouldn't necessarily be too bad? What would you say to that?
Well, there aren't any nice Zionists. I mean, Zionism as an ideology in practice means creating a Jewish state in the territory of historic Palestine. Now, the problem with that is that this is not, remains not an unoccupied territory. There are indigenous people there. They're called the Palestinians. Some of them, incidentally, were Jewish. There were indigenous Jews there from way back. I don't mean the early colonists in the 17 and 1800s. I mean what were then called Arab Jews, not called that anymore. The Zionists now call them Mizrahi, which is of course a Zionized term. So the Palestinians were there, and you can't get around that. There's no way around that. If they wanted to go and live in Antarctica, and they didn't oppress any native group or import any group which they didn't oppressed, well, that may be a sensible thing, but of course it's not a practical option, and it's never going to happen. So what you have to do is to say, look, Zionism is intrinsically racist, intrinsically genocidal. There isn't a nice Zionism which could coexist, because as soon as as Jews would coexist with whoever is in whatever part of the world they live in, it wouldn't be Zionism anymore. It wouldn't be Zionism. It would be,
Okay.
People say, so the thing which the Zionists bang on about, they say, well, when you talk about decolonization or de-Zionization, you're talking about the genocide of the Jews, aren't you? And I say, well, no. There's this conception that somehow that for people to stop being Zionist, that would be, you would have to kill them in order to stop them being Zionist. Well, no, Zionism is a political ideology. The majority of the Jewish community was not Zionist in the 1940s. The Board of Deputies used to be anti-Zionist until Zionism.
And it's quite a modern ideology, isn't it?
It's a modern ideology. And so, you can't just say, well, once we have peace, everyone will get on with each other, because of course they won't. Look what they've done. Look what they've done. Look what they're doing, the Zionists, every single day. Who could, hand on heart, say to any Palestinian, look them in the eye and say, you have to live with them? I don't believe anyone could do that. So what you've got to do is you've got to find a way to decolonize in a sensible way. Now, what that means is that those Jews who are currently in occupied Palestine, who want to stay, would have to make nice, that is, be citizens of a Palestinian state. And the proportion of Jews currently who look like they would be happy to do that is vanishingly small. Vanishingly small. There are, for example, there was a Jewish member of the Palestine National Council, Yuri Davis, who wrote that fantastic book on the GNF. There are some, but a settler colonial situation militates against that and militates against the interests of that. I mean, arguably, some elements of the Haredi population, the Satmar, people associated with Natura Carter, and similar anti-Zionist sects, they
anti-Zionist Jews, yeah.
They might find a way. They might find a way. But apart from them, they would make nice. But if they're not going to make nice, then they would have to either, one, be re-educated. Right? That's not necessarily an easy process. It's what the Allies agreed. The Allies and the Soviets agreed in Yalta in 1945 that the Germans would have to be denazified, and of course that's what you'd have to do with the racist ideology of Zionism. You'd have to de-Zionize the Zionists, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And people would throw their hands up in horror at the idea. But that is what you would have to do. And if not, then they would have to leave. And the rest, if they're not happy with either of those, then they would leave. And that's what they'd have to do. I mean, look, we currently have 40,000 American citizens living in occupied Palestine. 23,400 of them are fighting with the occupation forces. Now, what is the argument which says they have a right to live there after the liberation? No, I can't see the argument.
I mean, you've said.
Let me finish off that point. The point I would make is, look, how is it that you can de-Zionize, de-radicalize, let's put it that way, an ideology as harsh as Zionism, as racist, deeply racist as Zionism? How would you get them to believe that they were one Palestinian, come to see Arabs as human beings, come to accept that they have equal rights? How would you do that? It has to be impossible. I say, well, yes, look, it's very difficult, but there are examples in history of how people come to accommodate after the end of a settler colonial situation, where there's decolonization. South Africa, I guess, is one of those. There's some evidence from there, but I would also look at the question of Ireland. I mean, the people who were left behind in what was called the Free State from 1921 and the Republic from 1948, the Republic of Ireland, who did not, the Protestants who did not accept the decolonisation of the 26 counties. They were British. They would never accept being Irish. It was deeply held. They were Protestant supremacists, believed in their superiority, believed in the right of the British Empire, etc., etc., all the usual stuff that you see with the Zionists today. What happened to them? Within a generation, almost every one of them came to think of themselves as Irish. That's how you Zionize. That wasn't even a process which was done officially by the state in any kind of protracted manner, like we saw with the attempts to denazify the Germans after the Second World War. Of course, in that case, the Americans and the British and the French weren't very keen on denazification. The Soviets were a bit more keen. But yeah, I mean, you do have to do that seriously. Otherwise, what you find is that in a generation, the problem will still be there. And let me give you a concrete example of that. The 8,000 odd Ukrainian Nazis who were shipped into this country in 1947 from a holding camp in Italy. Some of them went to a camp up in Lockerbie in Scotland, where there's still a memorial to that camp and to the battalions who were there. Let's remember, Nazi battalions. And after about a year and a half, instead of denazifying these people, the British government said, "Oh, guys, you can go." And so they went. Some of them went to Canada. Some of them remained in the UK. They formed the Association of Ukrainians of Great Britain, an organisation which, since the Russian intervention in Ukraine, have been engaged in support activities for the Nazis in Ukraine. So that's the lesson of history. You've got to do this seriously.
Okay. I mean, I did have a question written here that, what's a plan for post-Israel in terms of, Zionization, but it's heartening to see that there's thought that's going on. I wonder if you have any other places that you could direct people to learn more about this in terms of what could a post Zionism solution or state or some kind of society look like when it comes to kind of de-radicalizing so-called Zionists.
I mean, I haven't seen much in the way of writing on this, but it's perfectly plain that you would have to do some kind of process of de-radicalization. Mm-hmm. And it wouldn't necessarily be easy, but you can't have genocidal Zionist maniacs walking around in a society which is at peace. No, that's not a society which is at peace. Yeah. Of course, what you would do is you would have, let me put it before I say anything else. Obviously, the key thing here is that it's up to the Palestinians to decide what form their society takes. It's called self-determination. But what you would have is you would have a Palestinian society, and to the extent that Jews wanted to stay there, there would be certain conditions upon that, including, I would guess, some form of de-radicalization, de-Zionization. I mean, one could set out a range of things that could be done in order to re-educate people such that they came to see Palestinians as human beings. They plainly, almost all of them, plainly do not see them as human beings at present. And I think that's been a shock for many, many people to see that actually the stuff that we were saying, the stuff that we were saying prior to Alex Aflatoon, people would say, "Oh dear, I'm not sure about what you think," and then I had lots of people come up to me and say, "Well, you know what you were saying? It kind of looks like right." And you were like, "Well, yeah. I mean, it's a racist ideology. What do you expect? It's a settler colonialism. That's what it does."
Yeah. I got one more question left, because you said on Twitter, and I think just a few moments ago, that Israel is at war with British Muslims. My question is, how do we win this war?
Well, we we have to de-Zionize the UK. I mean, the the I mean, Muslims have been subject to a war on their ability to practice their faith, their ability to function in society, their ability to engage in politics for 20, more than 20 years now. The prevent duty, stops and searches. I mean, Mozambique, I don't always agree with Mozambique and everything, but I mean, Mozambique did a good tweet on this yesterday where he said, look, here are the things they did to us in the last 20 years. You know, a this is a state-sponsored form of Islamophobia and a direct attack on the ability of Muslims to participate in the society. That's only going to get worse, and of course, it's also driven by the Israelis, and because they want there not to be any forces which can undermine the support for them in this country. And of course, they perceive Muslims as being the biggest threat, and that's because Muslims are the biggest threat. So you should take confidence in that they regard you as a threat, and therefore that we should, you know, take them at their word. Yes, we're a threat to them. Great, let's be a threat to them. And the way you do that is to foster much more engaged political action. I see that in many of the demonstrations which have chased off the far right in the last week or so, there's been Muslim presence, but there's not always been a massive Muslim presence at these demonstrations. And of course, part of the reason for that is that the British state is determined that Muslims will not get involved, and that's why they've had the mosque security advisors dispatched by MI5 to come and convince imams that they should tell the faithful that they shouldn't go out and confront the fascists. They've had all the various different intelligence front groups in the Muslim community, the London Faiths Forum or Faith Associates or Kari Asim or under a major Shi'i asset, Mustafa Field. All of these organizations which are funded by the British government, which are fronts for British intelligence, and which also, in many cases, are funded by the Zionists. I mean, so Mustafa Field's a good example. Runs his London Faiths Forum thing out of, do you know this? Out of a place called Collaboration House in Fitzrovia, in buzzy Fitzrovia, as they say on their website. And it's run and funded by the Austro Fair Share Foundation, which is run and owned by, financed by a Zionist businessman called Maurice Ostro. So look, this attack is not just, you're not just being attacked by the far right, not just being attacked by the neocon think tanks, also by Muslim organizations which pose as being the friends of the Muslim community, but which are in fact pursuing counterterrorism and intelligence agendas. So that's something which people need to be aware of and to counteract. So I mean, like an organization like, what have we got? Right, we've got Cage, we've got the MCB, we've got MEND, we've got MAB. There are some other organizations, right? And of course, there are Sunni and there are Shia organizations, etc. There needs to be an uptick in the level of Muslim engagement, because otherwise they will smash you. That's my advice.
So, in summary, Muslims should take a lead in the or more of a lead in the anti-Zionist kind of struggle, pro-Palestinian presence. We should build our grassroots and support our grassroots, the real organizations, rather than the quote-unquote astroturf ones. Build independent kind of political power as well, maybe, in terms of to stand on our own legs and to speak from our own, point of view and our own perspective. That's my takeaway from what you just said.
Happy with that. Yeah.
and pat ourselves on the back that we're seen as a big threat to Zionism.
Absolutely. I mean, you are a major threat to Zionism, more than the left is.
Okay.
But people, I think,
well done, Muslims.
Muslims don't really realize that. I mean, actually, you're a threat.
Yeah.
That's why they're targeting you. Why do you think they're doing this? Because you're a threat.
Well, one of the things we always say is that Muslim community is like a sleeping giant. We just need to be convinced of
wake him up.
Our power and use it and wake up. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Dr. David Miller. We've taken a lot of your time. Really grateful for you to share your insights and your thoughts and your time with us. So thanks very much for coming, and thanks very much for watching at home. If you like this podcast, give it a like and a share. Remember to comment and let us know anything you agreed with, disagreed with. If you liked it, press the thumbs up. If you disliked the podcast, press the thumbs down twice. That will really get the message across. But until next time, I've been your host, Salman Butt. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.